If visiting an ice cave in southern Iceland wasn't exciting enough, the journey to get there was just as spectacular. We drove over this crazy terrain on a 4x4, but when we stopped, we had to hike in even further, and it was like walking on an alien world. So we're out here in this incredible ice cave in southern Iceland. It's actually part of this giant glacier. So we hired an expert guide to drive us out on a 4x4 in this really great off-road terrain. We got up to the area and still had to hike about 15 minutes in till we came to this beautiful mouth of this cave. And this cave is amazing. The whole mouth of it was just a bunch of big blocks of black ice. And we were able to walk all the way through to the other side and see this big sort of coliseum of these ice blocks and stacks. And our guide helped us determine where we can go and where we can't go. So we had all this time to explore this whole area and get an idea what kind of shot we want. Walking through this cave, the first thing I noticed is the top. These beautiful patterns are being lit by the light coming inside of the mouth of the cave. So very quickly I realized that I can position myself about halfway in the cave, looking back towards the cave mouth, and I can take advantage of all this light and these beautiful patterns, creating these natural leading lines into the frame. So once I got my camera set up, rather than messing with specific exposures, I enabled my auto exposure bracketing and set it to 7 frames. That way I can cover the little bit of the light coming in the cave, and I can also get these dark shadows around that, so that in post-processing, using raw processing, I can pick which frame I want to work with to be able to accentuate the shadows and the highlights and have it perfectly balanced. So most often when I'm doing auto exposure bracketing, I'm using 3 or 5 exposures. This time I'm using 7 because I have to capture the entire range of light. I have really, really sharp highlights towards the mouth of the cave, and I have really, really dark shadows here back towards the camera. So using 7 exposures, I'm able to capture everything that I need, and then in post I can determine which one I want to use for my final image. So as I roll through these exposures, starting with the negative ones, you can see that I've exposed just for the mouth of the cave. Now that looks really cool, and as I go through these, you can see now that I've perfectly exposed for the dark elements in the foreground. Now this cave looks really, really big, which is what I really wanted. I wanted to show the magnitude and the scale of this cavern, but I think it needs one more thing. Sometimes it's hard to tell how big things actually are unless you can give it a sense of scale. And the perfect way to do it in this case is to put a person at the mouth of the cave. So most often, I'm not shooting with a partner. There's nobody else around. So if I want to put somebody in there as a sense of scale, I have to use myself. So this is going to kind of be like the ultimate selfie. I have my clean shots with nobody in them, and now I'm going to do the same thing. But before I shoot, I'm going to set my camera to a 30-second timer, and then I'm going to press the trigger, and I'm going to run out there and pose for my camera. So my guide also gave me this really cool ice pick as a prop. I'm going to hold that in the scene as well, and hopefully I'll look more ominous in the mouth of this cave. Okay, so the timer's enabled. I'm just going to click this, and then I'm going to run out into the frame. So I've taken a couple selfies, and I think they both look really cool. One, I'm just kind of standing there, and the other one, I'm using the cool ice pick. Now the only thing is I'm not exactly sure which one I like better, so I'll have to choose in post. So the next thing we're going to do is bring all this into post and put it all together. All right, welcome back to the studio. Lesson 6 for post-processing. Remember, this is from the ice cave. You should have just watched us shoot in the ice cave. I shot one set of brackets clean, one where I was standing there a little bit ominous, ended up looking a little bit sillier than I wanted it to, and one with an ice pick. So let's take a look at Lightroom together now. You can see that I've actually highlighted
the 3 different shots. I decided to bring 4 of the 7 brackets in for you guys to look at because I wanted to cut down the file size for the companion package that we're putting together for you guys. So this first one here is the cave with nobody in it. You can see it looks pretty cool. Actually, for the sense of scale, it with the reflection in the river, all these little details, it does look like a pretty big cave mouth. I don't really have any problems with the sense of scale, but let's see what happens if we add the human element. So there I am, there's the human element where I'm standing a little of what I thought was an ominous look. Patrick says I look like the Stay Puft Marshmallow Man, just a black jacket version of that one. Let's see what the ice pick one looks like. That's a little bit better, and it's rendering now. That looks a little bit better, a little bit more ominous. So I'm going to rule out the one where I'm just standing, and let's go ahead and take a look at a side-by-side from nobody to the standing with the ice pick. So the nice thing here is I don't only fill the area here and cause a nice sense of scale, but what's really nice here is the way that I did this composition, I tried to center it so I have some nice leading lines going off to the left. I have this black line going to the off center and some more white off to the right side on the top. The top looks awesome. The bottom have this river of water because this is starting to melt late or early in the season. It's just these caves are always changing, so some of them are always melting. Gave me the opportunity to have these really nice reflections, and then by standing in it, I actually have my reflection there as well. So there's no question what size this cave is. There's no question about anything. So in this case, I think I'm definitely going to go with the ice pick stance. So since I have selected this one, let's just take a look at the 4 exposure brackets that I've included in here. Take a look at the histogram. Make sure to keep track of that here on the right. As I roll through them, you can see that this is severely underexposed, but I have some of the details in the cave mouth. But as I start to come up here, you can see that the background, these highlights, start to become overexposed. So if I hit the J key again, we can see where the highlights are starting to be overexposed in those red pieces. Now here's what's really interesting. Right now, I can see that this is the only area that it's saying is overexposed, but you can see here, this is way too hot. It's hot because all of the surrounding pixels, not just the extreme highlights, are also turning white, and that's causing this whole thing to be hot. Even though the histogram says that it's right, if I turn the J key, nothing's actually clipped. Visually, this looks wrong to me. This looks a little bit better. In fact, this one looks really good. And then this one here, you can see that it's a little bit dark, but I have more definition in the foreground. Also pay attention to the reflections here. I want to retain as many of these reflections as possible. So I have a choice. I can either use this one here and roll back the highlights a little bit to maintain some of the highlights in the water, or I can use this exposure here and boost the shadows instead. Well, let me try the simplest one here, is to maybe be able to pull the highlights down and maintain the shadows the way they are. So with this one selected, let's pull down the highlights a little bit, and let's see if I can get that water back. And in this case, it looks like I can actually get the water back pretty well. And I'm going to bring the shadows up just a little bit more, just to compensate, just so I can get more tonality to play with later inside of Photoshop. I want to make sure that none of my blacks are clipped, and I want to give myself a nice palette to work with. We'll just check this one again, make sure that I have all the highlights here. We check this one, and honestly, I think it looks pretty good. So at this point, again, I've already neutralized the distortion, gotten rid of chromatic aberration, and also that pesky sharpening that Lightroom has built in. So now, just like usual, we've taken these steps inside of Lightroom. Let's bring it into Photoshop and take it even further. So I'm going to right-click, export with previous, which you guys should be pretty used to by now. There we go. That looks pretty cool. So the first thing I want to do is, since I've balanced this, and remember, pull the highlights back, push the shadows up, bring it into more of a mid-tone centric, bland image. I'm going to add some contrast back with my favorite plugin, Color Efex Pro Contrast. This is going to be a little bit simpler than usual. I'm not going to do a lot, just some dynamic contrast to pull the foreground colors up, some correct contrast, just so I can get those highlights back to something that I liked before without clipping them, being very careful on the right here. If I do clip the highlights a little bit, but I want to keep the blacks intense, I can always just compensate by moving the highlights over. This will actually clamp the area on the histogram that this whole effect will apply into, but I'm just going to be really careful. Now here's something interesting, because this is by nature very monochromatic. It's not black and white, basically has some gray hues, it has some blue hues, and really that's all there is to it. So we're not trying to create a lot of different colors here. So if I do a correct color cast, in this case it's going to think it should be warmer, and it's probably going to desaturate the whole thing, which is wrong. We really want all that really nice blue ice, so I'm going to leave it as is. So a little bit of dynamic contrast, a little bit of correction here just to pop out those details, and I think that looks pretty good. That's going to give me a good basis to start with. Something else that I might want to do is just add the filter. I might want to add a little bit more kick to this image with tonal contrast, and again, tonal contrast can replace anything that you would want something to have more of a dynamic look or an HDR look or anything where you just want more kick to the image. I try to call it punch sometimes, just to punch out those values. So let's crank the midtones just a little bit, the shadows just a little bit, and also the saturation just a little tiny bit. And this is just going to create this to be a little bit more detailed, a little bit more dramatic. So it fills in some of that contrast that I lost by doing the raw adjustment. I'm going to say OK. The result from Color Efex Pro looks pretty good. Let's just do a before and after. Again, if you don't like the way this looks or you think it went a little bit too far, in this case I do as well, I'm just going to duplicate the background layer, and I'm going to change the opacity so I can roll back the intensity of the effect just a little bit, just a taste. In this case, around 60%. I like the before and after a little bit better. I don't want it to be too intense. And I'm going to select the top layer, Command E to merge down, and now we have a before and after that's a little bit more subtle. Now here's when things get a little bit more interesting. This is a really blue cave. Obviously I don't want to take the blue out of the ice. I think it's beautiful, but what I want to do is I want to mitigate some of the reflective color cast that we're getting in blue. Now this is the first time that we've dealt with a completely blue scene. We have dealt with some black and white stuff where we don't really have to worry about color cast too much, but here what I'd really like to do, what I'd really like to achieve for this image is to have all of these different shades of blue and white, but I'd also like to accentuate the fact that there's some black ice. Actually, this is ice with dirt in it, and everything in this cave, it's actually lit from above. The sun is actually causing all this light to come through the cave and all these different cellular patterns. But you can see I have blue, white, dark blue, and black. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a few adjustment layers that are going to take some of the blue out of this dirt in the foreground to create more separation. So I'm going to do something a little bit different than I've done before with adjustment layers. I'm going to create a couple adjustment layers inside of a folder, and I'm going to show you why here just in a second. First thing that I want to do is figure out how much blue I want to remove from the foreground. So I'm going to create an adjustment layer, and I'm going to create a hue saturation adjustment layer. As I said, this is mostly all blue, so I don't really have to change it away from the master settings because I don't have too much red and yellow in the scene. But just to keep things consistent, we're going to be doing a lot of this later. I'm going to set it to blues and make sure that I'm only editing the blues. And all I'm doing here is sliding this little icon here. Basically, this just clamps or selects the area that I want to manipulate. So with the blues selected, again, most of the image is blue. If I change the lightness, you can see that I can darken that blue color, or I can brighten that blue color. I can also change the saturation, so I can desaturate the entire cave and all of the blues. Basically, what I want you to pay attention to are these rocks. These rocks are not blue. They're not ice. They should have a little bit of a blue cast, but not a total blue cast. So if I start to take the saturation down a little bit, you can see that I can remove some of the blue. If I start to take the lightness down a little bit, you can see that I can remove even more of that blue. And it creates something a little bit more separate. Right now, it's a global thing is happening. It's taking all the blues down. So what I want to do is I want to create one more layer first. So I'm only focusing on this. I don't care about the ice right now. I also want to create more contrast. So I'm going to say brightness and contrast. And I'm going to make this really contrasty in the foreground, these darks here. Really, this area here I want to be extremely contrasty and darker and less saturated. So now I have two adjustment layers. And what I haven't done before, I'm going to select both of these adjustment layers. I'm going to take them to a folder, and I'm going to create a mask on the folder. So now instead of just drawing on the mask for these adjustment layers, I can create a mask for the folder, and I can control both those adjustment layers with that same mask. So I'm going to go ahead and create a mask here. And I'm not going to do that actually. You guys remember I can hold Alt, click, and I'm going to create a black mask. So now what I can do is I can zoom in a little bit, grab the brush, again, just like I do with everything here, about 20%, and I'm just going to start to paint this in here. So I want to go ahead and paint that effect of desaturation into this area. And you can see as I start to paint, it starts to remove a lot of that saturation. I'm going to be really careful around here. I don't want to remove the saturation in the water. I only want to remove the saturation in the dirt. So I can even zoom in a little bit more around this guy holding the ice pick. I have no idea who that is, but he was conveniently placed for us. And I can just start to remove that blue. So again, I'm not trying to remove it all, and you can put the quick mask on with the backslash key. Helps a little bit just in case you miss spots. I'm pretty bad about missing spots, but it also makes it hard to see exactly what you're painting over sometimes. So it's good to do a combination of both, turning the quick mask on and off, just so we can get some of that. Now, be very careful, as I said, we don't want to remove the blue in the water. That looks really good, so make sure that you don't accidentally brush any of that. We just want to brush in all of this here. I'll just finish it up. Around this edge, I'm going to use a smaller brush, and I'm just going to sort of pull some of this out. I like the blue along the edge of the bank. And again, this is color. It's not as crucial because we're just removing some saturation from the foreground. If I check the quick mask again, you can see that I've forgotten this whole area because I was focusing on other spots. And that actually looks pretty good so far. I like it. I like it. Now we're starting to get somewhere. So we have created some color separation and some individual tonality for the cave. There's really not a whole lot we can do to this except for give it its own personality and just separate those colors. The camera picks up a lot of the color, but it also picks up color cast quite often. So this is a way to just mitigate some of that color cast and give yourself something where it was total blue before. Now we have blue and we have shades of blue mixed. And at this point with this mask enabled, I can go back into the brightness and contrast, and I can even turn the contrast up even more. So it's even a little bit more dark. I can pull the brightness down if I want to a little bit. And by pulling the brightness down, now I can take the attention away from this floor and up into the ceiling. Same thing with the hue saturation. I can decide by going back to the blues that I selected. In this case, it said cyans 2. I can change the lightness down or bring it up. Actually, I like it down. It's darker, and the saturation down. So now I have a dark foreground. So that's step one with the color separation. Next thing I might want to do is add some of that into the ceiling. So I'm going to do the same thing with the same mask, and I'm going to pull some of the saturation out of this area here, and I'm going to do that with a really light brush. The reason being is I want to leave some of that blue, but what I want to do is create a little bit more separation so that this area here is going to be a different shade than this, then this, then this, and then this. So I'm basically creating stripes or layers. And this is a color separation or contrast separation. Again, here where these should be a little bit less saturated because it's a dirtier rock. It's actually all that mud, all that dirt, and years and years of ice accumulation. So it's actually pretty cool. So this is making everything darker. I may want to add another hue and saturation layer. And this time in the blues, or even in the saturation is fine, but I'm just going to go right to the blues just to keep this consistent because I only want to affect those blues and cyans. I don't want any other color, if there was color to be affected. I'm just going to bring the lightness up a little bit, and that's going to desaturate it. So just similar to what I did before, I'm actually going to remove the saturation inside of just these areas here. So again, very light brush. Very soft brush, what I'm going to do is start to separate some of these blues as well. So now this will become less saturated version of the blue around here and maybe even around here. And I can follow some of these patterns, these natural patterns in the ice here, and I can actually create all of these cell patterns. And this is a very common thing to do. It's just like dodging and burning, but we're dodging and burning using saturation. So saturation is becoming our tool to create color separation, and that's very, very powerful. So we can have a lot of fun here just doing some different things here. And if I turn this on and off, it may be subtle, but you can see the difference. This is now looking like a monochromatic image, but just with a few simple adjustments, I can have it have a little bit more personality. The next step might be adding a dodge and burn layer so that just like I was controlling the saturation in areas, now I can change the lights and darks. Let's create a new dodge and burn layer by alt-clicking. I'm going to name it dodge and burn. I like being organized. You should always try to be organized yourself. We'll go ahead and fill that So we get the neutral layer. Now here's where it gets really fun. I love dodging and burning, and this is something that I do throughout each file that I work on that I think needs dodging and burning. It's also something that you don't have to do in any stage really because it's nonlinear. Turn the layer off and you can get rid of it, turn it on, and you can get it back. But here's the chance that I have to actually go in and add more of that separation. So say like these little cells of ice, we'll just call them cells of ice. We can actually make them more pronounced and more unique, which is really nice. Same thing here. Notice how these have really light areas and really dark areas. If I paint black over the dark areas, you can see that that's going to chisel them out. It's going to make them more pronounced. So this is where I can really go in and make my adjustments to make something that's a little bit more unique. By actually just popping out some of these light and dark details, gives it more dimension and actually gives it more separation. So each of these little pieces ends up looking like its own element. It's really important in photography, especially landscape photography, that you create depth. And depth is created by creating layers. And layers are created by using light or controlling shading. So if you think about this as actually a 3D object that I've captured in 2D space, by amplifying the highlights and working on the midtones around the shadow areas, I can actually make this look more three-dimensional. So it's almost like adding selective contrast. So really, I'm not changing reality, I'm just modifying the shading a little bit that I could have controlled probably very carefully if I had different lighting in the cave, if I would have just done stuff in camera. It's really not a far fetch from something that I could do naturally too. This is just easier to do it in Photoshop in a non-destructive manner. And it gives me the ability too, like here, see the highlights that I'm getting from the roof of the cave? Very beautiful, but I can also pull these highlights up more here. So I can say, well, I want that to be really, really noticeable in the water. If I take it too far, I can just tone it back a little bit. But I can really pull these highlights up so that the eye leads right into this strange guy standing there. So this is just scratching the surface of the effect that I'm doing with the dodging and burning. I can do this for hours, and I have on some scenes in the past, just to get it all right, just to get it completely the way that I want it. And it's almost like an airbrush artist would work, creating these little patterns and making things look really nice and tonally 3D. But something else that I can do is, now think about this as all ice, right? So it should look a little bit more crystallized. We've used a high pass filter in the past, pretty much in every file, but I'm going to show you guys how to take it a little bit further. So creating a high pass filter, we're going to create a duplicate here, duplicate of the background, and I'm going to say filter, other, high pass. For the landscapes, we've been using 3 pixels. I said 3 to 5 is fine, but for something like this, if I say 5 is going to be really dramatic. If I go even further to 5 or 6, it's going to be extremely dramatic. So the first thing I'm going to do is turn this on, set it to overlay, and now I want you guys to really notice this does destructive things to landscapes because it actually creates an effect that looks like things are crystallized. But since this is ice, it kind of looks cool if you do crystallize it. So take a look at the before and after here. This is without the sharpening applied. This is with the sharpening applied. And you can see if I zoom in really, really close here to this detail up in the corner, look how it was, and now look how it's popping all these little details out and making it look just a little bit more crystallized and different things like that. Unfortunately, this also causes issues around people. Now I'm getting a little bit of halo around the legs here and things like that. So if I turn this off, you can see that it looks a little bit better. So I don't want this effect everywhere, and this is really easy to get rid of it on the background just by adding a mask and brushing. And I'll just go ahead and say black at 100% opacity, and I'll just brush out the background. Now, as a general rule, what I like to do is create eye flow. Eye flow with composition, leading lines, all the stuff we talk about in camera, color, everything goes involved into it, but sharpness does too. So really, the sharpness starts to fade, so people notice all these cellular patterns, which is what I really want. This part of the cave is the most interesting thing. The element in the background is just a nice touch. So by ramping the sharpening down towards the center, we can really isolate what the eye sees and where it's drawn towards. So it can be really powerful in a lot of situations. And in here, having really sharp ice just looks awesome, in my opinion. with all of this in place, with the sharpening, with the color separation, I could go into the dodge and burn. As I said, I can spend hours on dodging and burning, and that's really going to be up to you how much you want to take it. For my portfolio version of this shot, it's definitely going to be even more subtle nuances. I'm going to make sure that they all look different, and cellular patterns, little textures and details all pop. But another thing that I really like here is we have this light, this great light coming out of the cave, and I've managed to maintain the correct amount of contrast and color range, and nothing's really blown out. But let's say I want to do something completely different. Let's say I want to create more of a glow coming from the back of the cave. What if I wanted to create something called an Orton effect? Now, Orton effects have become really popular in landscape photography, and it's how you get those really glowy skies or the really glowy light sources. And there's a really easy way to do it. In fact, there's a couple ways to do it, but my favorite way is to actually just use Color Efex Pro and some simple masking. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to take this layer and I'm going to go back in to Color Efex Pro. This time, I'm not going to use Pro Contrast. I'm actually going to use what's called Classical Soft Focus. Now, this is really nice. It takes care of a few steps for me. If you turn it on and off by its default settings, you can see now everything has a glowy effect. If I turn the strength up, you can see that I'm going to intensify that glow. So now it seems like the entire cave is glowing, and if I change the brightness, you can see that the brightness of that glow changes, and the diffuse detail also just changes the transmission detail of how much comes through. So right now it's already starting to look pretty cool. But what if I wanted to amplify this even more? I wanted it to be even more glowy and even more contrasty. Well, I could stack a filter on top of it. How about something like tonal contrast? If I add tonal contrast, then that's going to pop this glow, and you can see that it's going to make it extremely intense, too intense. So let's go ahead and zero everything out. All I'm really trying to do is, by cranking the midtones up in tonal contrast, you can see that I'm just making that glow a little bit more intense. So instead of working with those 3 sliders that I had in classical focus, I can change the contrast and the micro contrast inside of the highlights and the shadows to get something that I want. And in this case, I'm just doing a little bit of tuning. Saturation isn't going to play a big role here. You can see as I turn it up, it's just going to make everything look really poor blue. So I'm just going to turn that back down to around 0% so there's no change whatsoever. We'll go back to the classical soft focus. Let's go ahead and turn the strength up even more, and then we'll go ahead and say OK. I mentioned this was the Orton effect, but it's not quite there. An Orton effect, it's just sort of been coined, that phrase. Orton effect is sort of a glowy thing. If you ever see like a glow on the horizon and glowy highlights, dreamy look, that's sort of the Orton effect. So if we take a look at how this applied from Color Efex Pro, you can see that here's the before. Super clean, crisp details, and then with the Orton effect on top of it, it's super glowy. So you might like this the way it is. You might think this looks like a dreamy world or something like that. I don't really like it. What I want to do is just control this in certain areas. First thing that I'm going to do is change the opacity a little bit, and as you can see, I can change how much of this effect plays through just by changing the opacity. So all the way to 100 is probably a little intense. I can take it down to about 80, make it a little bit more subtle, and I'm going to black out a mask by holding Option, clicking the mask, and instead of having that be a global thing, switch to the brush as usual, and I'm going to brush that glow in exactly where I want it. Well, I know I want it coming out of the mouth of the cave, and I know I want it to be glowy around here, I want it to be glowy around here, and this is where it gets really fun. Now, pay specific attention to where light wraps around areas. So for these Orton effects to work really well, I don't like them to be all over the place. In fact, it'll blow out a lot of the values. But if people feel like it's glowing from a location, from a source, so a light source, then they're going to feel much better about it. And this is just going to create not only some of the glow, but also a little bit of softness around the hardness here. So we've gone from something like this to now giving it a little bit of glow and a little bit of personality from the cave mouth, which looks really cool. The nice thing is we also have our sharpening over top of that, so the sharpening still applies even though the glow destroys the sharpening. So again, this can be done, and then once you have it, adjust the opacity. Even at about 100% opacity, it still looks pretty cool. You can see that if we zoom in, to me there, it looks like I'm being engulfed by light. Instead of just this black object, now I'm being engulfed by the light from the mouth of the cave. And the cool thing again is we can just paint any of this in. Now at this point, I just want to do some final touches here. I may add, let's say, a curves layer, because I feel like I want more brightness out here on the edges. So I'm going to do the same thing I did in the last files. I'm going to change the curves a little bit. And this time, when I like the curve values, I'm just going to go ahead and black out that mask. So I'm going to flood it with background, which is going to be Command-Delete to flood with background. And in this case, I'm just going to paint in some more brightness here to the edges. So I just want to paint that brightness back in. Now again, this is where things start to get a little bit subtle. So you have to really spend time to do this and get it the way that you really like it. Again, if I go back to the curves here, you can see that now I'm able to just control those specific areas that I wanted to highlight, and that actually looks pretty good. I'm just going to paint a little bit more in. Last final touches to this image, I'm just going to go back into my dodge and burn, and I'm going to carve out a few more of the cell patterns above the glow, and you can see that I can actually still dodge and burn above the glow. So I can make this a little bit darker, and let's see if that's actually causing some issues there. I don't think it's causing some issues. Let me just make sure I have the right thing selected. Put this down back on the bottom and just really, really softly go into it. So 0.5. There we go. That's better. So just darken up these areas a little bit so that glow becomes localized, a little bit more of a localized glow. And the more I do, the more I start to sort of carve these different highlights and shadows out, the more personality we start to get with this image. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to go back into Lightroom, and I'm going to go ahead and bring in the original exposure with no adjustments, just by resetting the tone. And I'm going to say export with previous, use unique names, and we're going to bring this in so we can see the final composite of where we started in the before and after. Let's copy everything, paste it in, bring it to the bottom, and then here's where we started, the original raw, straight out of camera, awesome ice cave, and then at the end here we've actually transformed it into this really glowy cave thing. And again, after seeing the before and after, any of this can be changed, it can be tweaked, can be turned down to the effect that we want until we get exactly the look that we want to achieve. So again, we can go before and after, and now it just has a little bit more personality. So in this case, there wasn't a lot of color to work with. I chose to go subtle. I wanted really sharp details. I wanted to chisel out the cell patterns of the ice, and I also wanted to create a nice glowy Orton effect. As you can see, it's really easy to do. Everything's on separate layers above, so it's all controlled with transparency. It's all controlled and masked by the paintbrush, by easy, simple brush strokes that can all be changed and modified. So it's a completely non-destructive workflow. At any stage, we can go in and edit the transparencies of this and create a custom image. So we might like this now, close it, open it up a couple days later when you're committing it to your portfolio, and you may see some things you want to tweak. This workflow allows you to make those tweaks on the fly whenever you need to. So that's it for this lesson. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm going to see you next time. We're going to do something else epic in Iceland.